Yeah, well, thank you very much and welcome. Wherever you are in the world, I'm talking to you from, I'm going to say Toronto. Actually, for people that live in Toronto, they will know I actually live in Mississauga, Ontario, which is right next door to Toronto in Canada, as is Dr. David Weiss. It's my great pleasure to introduce David. My name is Andrew Maxwell. I'm a professor of tech entrepreneurship at the Son School of Engineering, York University. Very involved with ISPIM over the years. We hosted the ISPIM conference, I guess, 2017. And been to most of them in person. Great to have everybody on board today. It's my great pleasure today to introduce Dr. David Weiss. David is the president of Weiss International, and it's an international consulting firm that's based in Toronto, focusing on innovation. He has a doctorate from University of Toronto. I'm not going to go through all your bio because I tell people read it on LinkedIn. You don't have to go through it all. He has 3 master's degrees, which I'm very jealous of because that's one more than I have. But he's worked both in the private industry in consulting around leadership development and innovation. He's also a well-known author. He's written several books, including Innovative Intelligence and the Leadership Gap, and he's worked with companies on a global basis. He also teaches executive education at various parts of York University that I'm affiliated with. And it's a great pleasure to have you join us today and share some insights on innovation leadership and what it takes and how people might improve on it and what the challenges are. So welcome, David. I'm going to just mention one thing before we finish, which is at the end, we are going to be open for questions. I have several boring questions, which I will ask if nobody else asks better questions from the audience. It's a 30-minute session, so over to you, David.
Thank you very much. It's a real pleasure to be here and looking forward to sharing ideas with you and putting ideas out, learning from you. We're all in, exploring and trying to build capabilities. And that's what I'm going to focus on today, leadership capabilities to enable innovation. In the work that I authored, Innovative Intelligence, we were really exploring what it takes to be a leader of innovation. And what I'd like to share with you today are 3 capabilities of leaders of innovation. And throughout the event, I'd ask you to think about how does this apply to what you were trying to do in the space of innovation, what you were trying to do in terms of building leadership capability and leadership capacity, and how this might augment what you are contemplating at the present time. So that's me. A lot of the work is based upon that book that I co-authored, as well as subsequent research that I've done quite a bit on. I am going to share with you in the chat box hopefully eventually an article that I wrote, which was about the topic of complexity, which really relates to innovation. And what I'd like to do today is I'd like to focus on 3 capabilities, and I want to see whether or not that resonates with you. The first one is that there are many people who think that innovation applies to everything. And I'm going to argue that innovation in particular works well for complex situations and issues, even more than what I'm going to call complicated issues. We've done some terrific work in lean and DIMAIC in a variety of different methodologies that have worked from what I call an inside out perspective, where we're looking at something and we need to continuously improve it. So inside out, continuous improvement. I've got a process. We know the process. How do I take that process and keep on evolving it to making it better and making it stronger? When you're dealing with complexity, when you're dealing with innovation, in most cases, it's outside in. Design thinking is all about starting with the user, starting with the experience of the individual, the pain points they might have. And that outside in perspective is where innovation really excels, where you get that dynamic that says, we need to be rethinking almost what we're doing currently. It's not about improving what we are currently doing inside out, which I'll call complicated, versus complexity, which tends to be from the outside in experience. So that's going to be the first message that I'd like. So based upon that, I'd like to explore this. So I imagine many of you have heard the term VUCA. VUCA has been around for a couple of years. It stands for volatile, so the world is very volatile. The world has lots of uncertainty, lots of complexity. There's a great deal of ambiguity. And when I think about these things, this word complexity pops up again. We're dealing with where no one even knows the right answer. No one knows where we're going. Lots of ambiguity in terms of what is the right thing to do. Stakeholders have different perspectives. I even tried to flip this to almost like an answer to the problem, but I thought of, what if we use the letters VUCA in another way? So the V stands for vision, but not in terms of a future state, but rather vision in terms of purpose. To actually deal with the VUCA world as a leadership capability, we need to get people who are purpose-driven. Why do we exist? As Simon Sinek talks about, starting with why. The U means for understanding, and instead of uncertainty, now we're saying we're in a world where if there's so much ambiguity and uncertainty where no one knows what to do, we have to make sure that everybody understands everything that we know. So everybody needs to know why we're doing something, what we're doing, how we're doing it, and be engaged in the process. And to do that, we really have to unleash the curiosity of everyone. And what that would simply mean is that it's not that authority has opinions and others don't. Leadership is no longer about I have knowledge and you don't. Knowledge becomes a shared resource, and I need to unleash that capability, that curiosity of everyone in order to get the understanding, drive that purpose, and deal with this complex environment. And agility really reflects the notion, not agile thinking specifically, it's not talking about a technique, but the ability to recognize that maybe in the world that we used to exist in, it was a stable state, and then you went through change, and then you restabilized. But that's not the way the world works. In the VUCA world, we're in an unstable world. Maybe we get a bit more unstable, and then we continue to be unstable. So agility says that we need to get ready to iterate. Nothing is going to be fixed. Things will be continually moving. We've seen that in the COVID world. We've had to respond to tremendous complexity and unknowns, and when no one knew the answer. And so getting that clear purpose in mind, getting everyone to understand, really unleashing and valuing everybody's opinion and insights, and creating the culture where people accept the fact that we're not going to solidify, but we're going to need to keep on adjusting and moving, and becomes part of those capabilities in dealing with complexity that we're describing. So in an article that I wrote in 2017 on decision-making for complex situations, I look at complexity as, for example, building earthquake-resistant towers is complicated. What I mean by that is there's research, there are best practices, and these things, if I'm going to implement it, we talk about waterfall technique. If you're going to implement an earthquake-resistant tower, I don't expect you to iterate. Get it right the first time. Don't build a tower and say, gee, I got to fix it. So that's a complicated task, a very complicated task. But it ultimately has a methodology, it has research, it has best practices. We're able to implement that. But climate change is complex. No one really knows, or some people think they know. We have different stakeholders. People are having strong different perspectives. In that complex world, what ultimately is required is the ability to use a different source of data. And that's, we need to be dealing with the unknowns and the uncertainties in that VUCA world. Managing inventory is very, very complicated. It could be very challenging, but there are research, there's best practices, and ultimately we can leverage that. While mapping out a corporate strategy would be far more complex. Every situation is going to be different. Every situation will have unique properties. The third one is diagnosing a machine's performance is complicated. In fact, machine kind of mindset is used as the perfect example. My starter, or at least I thought it was, on my car wasn't working. So it wasn't all the time kicking in and actually beginning the ability to turn the motor on. So I called a company. I thought it was a starter. They said, no, it's not your starter. Then I said, well, the local service people, I said, well, maybe it's my battery. And they said, no, it's not your battery. And I was wondering about it. Finally, I brought it to an expert, and the expert found the small thing that was ineffective. In a complicated world, you replace the small thing in the machine, and then the machine works. Complexity is more like a CEO, assessment. Everyone's going to be different. It's more like a child. If I have two children, the second child's not the same as the first. each one requires appreciation of their uniqueness. Each one brings their own complexity, and we need to be appreciative of that. So I want to give you some sense of what I mean by complicated and complex. And the message is that for every complex problem, there's a solution that is simple, neat, and wrong, because you're going to apply this kind of standardized methodology, and that ultimately will get in the way. So Mencken gave a wonderful quote on that one. So if we look at this, let me just actually take it to the back of the room. I want to draw this out for you one step further. So what I'm going to do here is if you want to go to my picture in the upper three dots and just click on pin, the word pin, you'll see that my picture is going to come up really large. And I'm going to walk to the back of the room just to do something a little different. You know, after all, this is a program about innovation. So do I sit in front of a camera the entire time, or do I do this a little bit differently? And here's what I'd like to do. I'd like to take you through for a moment just a picture of a whiteboard. This is in the back of my office here. And hi, here I am again. Nice to see you. Let's just mix it up a little bit just to change the venue. We're just looking at too many people at screens. So basically what I was sharing with you before was that, you know, we have to distinguish between complicated and complex. But here's a way to think about it and the capability that I want leaders to have. And this is the first one. With this one on this side is the degree of agreement. So that's about stakeholders. Does everyone agree on that? And I'm going to be a little weird. I'm going to put the high on the bottom and put the low on the top. Now, I know that's very different. Usually it's the reverse, but for this model, that's the way it works. And the same thing will apply down here. This one is talking about the degree of certainty. So do we know what to do? So for example, making rice, boiling rice. You know, you may not be good at it. That could be a problem, but we pretty much know there is a certainty way of doing that. We pretty much don't have disagreement on it. So agreement is high. As a result, we call something in that category simple. Now, something that we call simple might have been complex or complicated at another time. Refrigeration, for example. Refrigeration is something that, you know, pretty strong certainty of how to do it. Pretty much everyone agrees. So I think it's simple until my fridge breaks down. But, you know, at one point, 100 years ago, it was a very, very challenging task, and it was causing major challenges of transporting, let's say, food or grain or whatever over long distances, because you couldn't freeze it, you didn't have the refrigeration. But now that we have it, it's kind of standard. And in fact, one of my colleagues, Dr. Jag Sheth, used to say, any innovation that occurred before your birth is not considered an innovation. So for me, an iPhone is really cool. It's a great innovation. But for a 3-year-old, an iPhone is a pencil. You know, it's not innovation. It's the way life is. You know, the iPhone that came about in 2007, 2008. So we got simple things. But when you get to complicated, the degree of certainty starts getting a little muddier. The degree of agreement gets muddier. And what we've done for the past 100 years is gotten very, very good at taking very complicated challenges, you know, building earthquake-resistant towers, building a car, you know, and ultimately driving it to simplicity. So what we've done in the former leadership capability, where we were working intensely on complicated, was what we did was we said, we need expertise. And the one who is expert in something, that's the person who will get the position. We need people ultimately who have the experience. So we do resumes, and we'd say experience would be crucial. You know, knowledge would be crucial, because we want you to have the most knowledge, the most experience to guide people as we chunk this thing up and break it up into its parts, so that ultimately we can get whatever we want to get done. When we put a team together to work on a complicated problem, we would put together a bunch of experts in a similar field and let them say, how do we actually leverage our expertise, our science? This is what R&D does a lot. So the researchers, let's get them together and apply all of our knowledge ultimately to see if we could figure out what's the right vaccine methodology for COVID. And those people, brilliant. I can't contribute to it. I don't know anything about that. I have no ability to add value to it, but it's an incredibly complicated task. and ultimately you get the right people, they know how to work together, you might be able to break it down and then have it distributed to, billions of people around the world. The interesting thing about this complicated world is that it's based upon two factors that we rely on: research, and we also rely ultimately on best practices. So others have done it, it worked, and we have research that supports it. So if we have these things over here, then that's where the waterfall technique, get it right the first time, really applies. But what happens if we're in the world where the degree of certainty is now very low? And actually, we got lots of disagreement. Climate change, we're dealing with measuring a CEO's performance. All of a sudden, we're in a complex world, and that's what Mencken was saying, that, you know what, if you're dealing with complexity, then ultimately we're in a situation where if you get a quick answer, you'll get a quick answer. It might be simple, but it will be wrong because you're applying the wrong approach. Here's the point. Number one, leadership capability to drive innovation requires a disaggregation of complex and complicated thought. We need the complicated folks to focus on doing the process I described before. Complexity now doesn't have research and doesn't have best practices. So all of a sudden now we're dealing with a human-focused, a human-centric source of data. The problem with human-centric data, though, is it's messy. I ask people, what are your pain points? What are you worried about? This is what drove technology innovation, is this level of complexity. And they give you some answers, but they don't know what it is. So I can't get it right the first time. All of a sudden, I'm dealing with, over here, a great deal of uncertainty. That's one of the words in VUCA. Or I'm dealing with a great deal of ambiguity, another word in VUCA, as part of this complexity. And I'm relying on human source of data. So an insight for leaders is that in complexity, you have to appreciate the user's experience, the customer's experience, the patient's experience, the student's experience. The citizen's experience. We have to identify them in those complex environments as actually being a valid source of data equal to research and best practices, especially when that's not available. And so what we need to do in that context is actually go to that source of data and ask them what it is, but we're not going to get it right. And this is where iteration comes in, which is a key part of dealing with complexity and part of that expectation that we want of leaders. And that expectation is the ability ultimately to put out a minimal viable product, put out something that ultimately they can deal with, and through that process, ask the user, ask the human being, did I get it right? And they'll say, no, you got it sort of right. Go back, do it again. Go back, do it again. So you're iterating, testing, going back and doing it again and again and again. And the reason why we have to do that is no one knows the right answer. So we have to iterate to get the right answer. So for complex situations, I'm going to come back to the table. For complex situations, that's where it's really required. But for complicated situations, get it right the first time. So we're not, this is not saying there's a magic formula of design thinking for everything that we do. We need to start saying that, there's a time where it's right, and there's a time where, in fact, it may not be exactly what's required. So so I mentioned to you that I would share with you an article in the chat box, and this is an article called "Decision Making for Complex Thinking." If you want it, it's a free download. You're invited to have it, and I'm going to put it into the box. It'll give you a little bit more depth on what we're talking about, so you can open it and download it. It's about a 4 or 5 page article. So I want to go back to the materials that we were talking about a moment ago. So one of the leadership capabilities, this is Stanford, talked about embracing complexity and social enterprise change. Innovation works best for complex situations and issues. So in the next 10 minutes that we got, the next few minutes before we get to questions, I want to drive the notion that innovation works best with diverse teams within precise boundaries. This is a capability that leaders really need to start getting better. I go into organizations, and what I find is that they are, I ask them quickly, just ask them the question, if you go into organizations, if that's your role, and ask them the question, do you have silos? That kind of thing they put grain into in a farm. And somehow that caught on as meaning that you have organizational pieces that don't talk to each other. And if they say yes, I know they have trouble with innovation, because complexity, by nature of being something that no one knows the answer to, doesn't have an expertise. And therefore, we need diverse thought. It requires diverse thought in order to generate new ideas. But help me out a little bit. If you know there's a boundary, if you know, for example, that there is a situation where we must ultimately not spend more than this amount of money, or don't restructure our place, or don't change our technology, because it's now looser and we're all over the place when we're working on our ideation, what ends up happening is I need to know, are there any lines around which I really shouldn't play and experiment that much, because I'll be wasting too much time. So leadership capability number 2 is innovation works best with diverse teams. So you have to get good at working with different perspectives and within precise boundaries. And just to, one of the key points is a lot of people use the word creativity and innovation as basically saying the same thing. I don't. Creativity is really important. I'm a musician. And if I'm writing music, I go as broad as I possibly can, no boundaries. Most organizations, when they think innovation, is they think deep, which leads me to, within precise boundaries with diverse teams, do a deep dive into it and figure it out. Which basically says that ultimately we need to know that innovation really is creativity with purpose. Innovation is about a focused process in most organizations. So leaders need to work with those diverse teams, and ultimately, if you don't work with diverse teams, you'll get groupthink. We need to get those clashing of ideas, mix it up so that we get all these different thoughts coming out. And then ultimately, innovative thinking becomes user-focused. Remember, it's around complexity for complex issues that gains insight into user pain points. You ideate, you iterate to discover innovative solutions with diverse teams and so on. Yeah, you come up with my little musical. Yeah, you're combining strange things together that ultimately works. So that's point 2. The last one, and I think it's the big idea, is that for years we've been working on trying to make people more innovative. And what we found is that actually is really hard to do. You spend 30, 40, 50 years of your life, and you have a cognitive process, and you are as innovative or not innovative as you are. So if I train you to become more innovative, as Malcolm Gladwell said, I need 10,000 hours with you to really push your brain, and I'm not going to get 5 years out of you. So, but I can develop you much more rapidly into leaders of innovation, meaning a leader at your level of innovation that can work with a diverse team within precise boundaries on a complex issue to draw out your innovative capacities, mix it all up, and let's see if we can get somewhere altogether. So going back to what we said, analytical intelligence, that's been what we've been driving for the complicated world, where we ultimately are people who are dealing with knowledge and experience. For those in this group over here who are dealing with resumes, it doesn't give us the insights that we need for innovative intelligence. Here, we need the ability to deal with ambiguity, uncertainty. We need you ultimately to demonstrate that curiosity, curiosity and comfort with the unknown, innovative thinking, drawing out innovative ideas from others, the ability to iterate and say, if you're working in healthcare, that this is what I'm looking at, show it to a user, does it make sense, and coming out with something as beautiful as that. Through an iteration process, you do it. And here's another secret that we found, is that emotional intelligence, interestingly enough, becomes a critical part of the new capability for leaders that are going to be demonstrating ability to work in innovation. And the reason why is that if we're going to be in an environment that's going to have diverse people working together, where there's going to be conflict without contempt, we have to have leaders who are emotionally able to handle that kind of conversation. They have to be able to be comfortable to toggle between the analytical intelligence where they know the answer and the innovative intelligence where they don't know. And they are comfortable with saying, I don't know. A lot of leaders aren't comfortable with that. The deal when they got the job was they were the smartest or the best at the job. Innovations demanding that they deal with complexity when no one knows. So analytical intelligence is that competence, experience, knowledge, Innovative intelligence requires a curiosity, handling complexity, design thinking, and emotional intelligence deals with that courage, self-awareness, and derailment factors. Make sure that you don't ultimately get in the way. So if I'm hiring someone, yes, I do still want to know if they have performance and credibility, but at the same time, I want to know that they're learners. Are they fixed? Or are they people who are comfortable with saying, I don't know, and they have a learning agility, which is powerful. And then at the same time, do they demonstrate emotional intelligence? At least at minimum, they don't have any derailment factors. In other words, are they scary people? Are they bullies? Are they conflict averse? Could they handle diverse people working? Can they handle the unknown? If they have emotional difficulties with issues, then they will likely not be able to demonstrate that innovative intelligence. So in the end, the 3 capabilities I'd ask you to think about: innovation works best with complex situations. It works best with diverse teams and precise boundaries. And think of building leaders of innovation more than building innovative leaders. It's a much, much more doable outcome and will generate much faster results. So hopefully from this, you learned those 3 capabilities. And I'd ask you to think about how you can apply this on an ongoing basis to whatever world and part you're contributing to this to help build leadership capabilities to enable innovation. I'm going to pause over there, and I want to thank you again for your time. And we'll spend 5 minutes now. I'll pass it back to Andrew for any questions or comments from the audience that you'd like to chat about.
So David, thank you very much. Lots of positive feedback on the chat. I think really interesting insights, and I certainly agree with all of your challenges. I have one personal question I wanted to ask. We've talked a lot about emotional intelligence over the years, and has the definition of emotional intelligence changed with our move into innovation? So, for example, we're always looking for resilience, people that are coachable or resilient, as what I'm going to call emotional intelligence. But does emotional intelligence expanded to include those things that we see, the willingness to work with ambiguity and failure, or do we need to augment the original definition with the new innovation terms?
So I'd actually agree that we need to augment the perspective of emotional intelligence. Certainly people have augmented emotional intelligence to expand to issues not only you were describing it of being emotionally mature in interaction, but even a whole different level of mindfulness. So we're seeing that emerging in the workplace much more at this point. But what I'm doing here, which I found in our research and our work in the area of innovation, was the connection of emotional intelligence to innovation, which needs to be thought through and actually built upon. The issue is, if we work emotional intelligence backwards and we say, what is a key platform that will enable people within diverse groups with unknowns and uncertainties to have meaningful conversations, conflict without contempt, and generate new outcomes? If they don't have emotional intelligence, or if they're limited in that area, and the other participants as well, it's not just the leader, because you can mess it up just with one person, then what will occur is that will sacrifice what I call psychological safety. So all these things are related. The psychological safety within the organization is related to the emotional intelligence. And I'm an and also person, not an either or person. So it's how to everything linked together. They're all part of the same story. But I am doing it not from starting from emotional intelligence and saying, how can I augment it? I'm saying, what do we need for leaders of innovation? And a premise is that we've got to get them more capable in that emotional side.
Thank you so much. I have one very quick question because we're going to run out of time. Is there a definite boundary between complex and complicated, or is it kind of a blurred boundary? I mean, how do I know which one I'm dealing with? How do I know if I need to get a bunch of experts together or diverse perspectives together?
So one of the key parts in this complicated, complex world is, in most cases, situations you encounter have characteristics of both. Even let's say something as dramatic as climate change, and we're dealing with this kind of very difficult thing. Yes, I need a diverse group, different mindsets that ultimately work together. But at some point, we'll probably have some requirement to build it. So if we decide that seaweed could actually, deal with world hunger, if we're dealing with world hunger for argument's sake, at some point, I'm going to need my technical people to work on it. But so one of the challenges in situations that I'd ask leaders to get good at is to disaggregate the situation from the complex to the complicated. What are the parts that are complex that require this diverse group, that need that outside-in thinking? And then what are the parts that are more complicated that ultimately a bunch of experts would work? And here's the way that I know how it actually works well. If you reverse engineer this and you say something like, well, I don't know anything about that topic. Am I able to contribute to it in a meaningful way? That's probably because that's the complex part. If I know nothing about the topic and they're talking about something and I'm unable to contribute to it, it's probably because it's the complicated part that requires experts. So I know immediately how to get to it, and that ultimately creates disaggregation. But most situations have both. I want to thank everybody for being here today, and I just want to wish you a wonderful conference.
Thank you so much for your time, for your insights. I just posted, we have a website which you've already contributed in the past called disruptiveinnovation.io. We will post this session on that. I'm not sure what the other ISPIM sessions will be able to post, but we'll be posting a couple, and we have events there, and hopefully David will be joining us for more things in the future. Thank you so much for joining us today. Thank you for your time, David. Thank you for your great support and questions. And if you're part of the ISPIM conference, I hope you enjoyed the rest of the conference. If you're not, and you're not doing anything at 1 o'clock, please check out our innovation skills session that Omid already posted. Thank you again, David.
I also put my website into the thing. There's about 50 articles you can ultimately print off in the free articles section. Please do. I don't hound people. Pleasure meeting you, everybody. All the best. Stay safe. Thank you.
Thank you so much.